Welcome dear children to another video session. In this video, we are going to see the summary of chapter 12, Friction. You have noticed a rolling ball slows down by its own when it is not applied by an external force, or a vehicle it stops while applying brakes. Why does it happen so? Or why do we slip when we step on a banana peel? You have found the answer for all these questions during our interactive session. When one object it moves on the surface of another object, it slows down. Yes, it is due to the frictional force between the surfaces. Frictional force, it is a force acting between the two surfaces in contact when they are trying to move relative to each other. And this frictional force, it will be always opposite to the applied force, and it will be opposite to the direction of motion, and also it will be parallel to the surfaces. We will discuss more about frictional force in this chapter. So let us see the mind map of the chapter. Dear children, let us see the mind map of the chapter. Chapter 12, Friction. In the first section of the chapter, we have learned what do you mean by frictional force. When two surfaces in contact tries to move each other, there will be a force exerted between the two surfaces, and that force we will call it frictional force, which will be always opposite to motion. The frictional force will be opposite to the applied force, and it always try to resist motion. So what will be the nature of this frictional force? As we said earlier, it will be opposite to the applied force, and it will be parallel to the surfaces in contact. So now, after that we have discussed what are the factors affecting frictional force. The frictional force greatly depends on the nature of surfaces in contact. More accurately, it depends upon the irregularities of the surfaces. More irregular surface will be having more frictional force in between. So frictional force will be greater when the surfaces included are rough. Let us verify this factor. Let us do a small experiment to verify the friction and how the frictional force it is affected by the nature of surfaces in contact. Here I have got a plain sheet and two blocks. See, one block it is plain and the other block it is covered with a sandpaper. Now we will see the effect of friction on these two surfaces. First I will place a plain block on the surface and try to move it. Initially I am taking the plain block and placing it over the sheet. Now let us see the effect of friction on the plain block. Initially the block will be at rest and it won't move. Why? Because the frictional force exerted by the surface on this block, it will be greater than the gravitational force. Now, if I slightly increase the slope, you can see here the gravitational force at this point, it will be greater than the frictional force exerted on the plain block. Now we will do the same experiment with one with the plain block and other with the block on which there is a sandpaper coating. So we will see the effect of friction on these two surfaces. So when I place this block, initially both of the blocks will be at rest. When I slightly increases the slope, see here, now you can see the first block, like the frictional force exerted by the surface on this block, it is less. That is why it came first. Now if again I increase the slope, see at this point only the slope it coated with the sandpaper, it falls down. That means the friction offered to the surface of sandpaper, it will be more, or you can see the rough surfaces of the sandpaper. So the friction will be more in the case of rough surface than that with the smooth surface. So children, we have seen one of the factor affecting friction, that is the nature of the surfaces in contact. The second factor which affects the friction is how much harder a surface is pressed. Have you ever experienced dragging a mat simply and dragging the same mat when one person is sitting over it? You have noticed that in the second case the friction will be more. So how much harder the surfaces are pressed together, that also affects the friction. Next we are going to see the different types of friction. They are static friction, sliding friction and rolling friction. So what is static friction? It is a frictional force that we need to exert to move a static body into motion, or the frictional force needed to overcome the state of rest, that is called the static friction. So what will be the sliding friction? Once the objects start moving, there will be a frictional force between the surfaces. The force needed to keep the object moving with the same speed, that we call it as static friction. So from our practical experience, we have noticed that we need to exert more force to get an object moving from rest than to keep it moving with the same speed. That means sliding friction, it will be always less than the static friction. Now what will be the rolling friction? If one object rolls over another surface, there will be a force opposite to the motion. This resistive force we will call it rolling friction. But this rolling friction, it will be always less than the sliding friction. We might have always noticed it is easier to roll an object than to slide it. You have noticed that this feature in the case of when you are dragging a trolley bag with rollers. It will be more easier to drag a trolley bag with rollers than to slide it over a surface. And in the last section of the chapter, we have discussed the different techniques to increase and decrease friction, and friction is a necessary evil. Also we have discussed about fluid friction. So children, is friction always bad? Have you ever imagined if there is no friction between your pencil and your fingers, or pen or your fingers, will you be able to write? So can you be able to walk if there is no friction between your foot and floor? So children, some sort of friction is necessary, but on the other hand it is an evil too. Friction will cause unnecessary wear and tear in materials. The friction between two surfaces, it produces heat. In that aspect, it is a loss of energy. So friction, it creates a lot of wastage of energy. Also it causes wear and tear in materials. And next section we have seen the different techniques to increase and decrease friction. In some cases where friction is desirable, there are some techniques to increase friction. For example, you might have noticed the grooves on the shoes, or you might have noticed the treaded tires of cars and trucks. All these are done to improve or increase the friction between the tire and road, or your shoes and the floor. So in such cases we can increase friction, and in some cases we need to decrease friction. For example, all of you might have played caroms at least once, right? So in the carom board we used to sprinkle powder. So what does it for? It is to reduce the friction between the carom, the coins and the board. Also you might have seen like oils or grease being applied on the hinges of the doors or between parts of machinery. So all these are done to reduce the effect of friction. So these are the different techniques that we adopt to increase or decrease friction. In the last section of the chapter, we have discussed about fluid friction. So children, what are fluids? Fluids are substances which possess the property of flowing. So here in science, when we say fluids, it refers to both liquids and gases because it has the property to flow. So these fluids also offer some friction to the objects moving through them. We call this friction as drag. So the drag offered by a fluid to the substance or object moving through them, it mainly depends upon the shape of the object and the nature of the fluid. So have you ever noticed the similarity between the birds and the shape of an aeroplane? So you can see it is a streamlined shape. They adopt this shape in order to reduce this drag offered by air. Similar is the case with fishes and with the shape of a submarine. Both are streamlined. This is in order to reduce the effect of drag at depths. So children, these are the different techniques adopted to overcome the drag offered by fluids. So children, that is a mind map all about. Hope this video help you to get the summary of chapter 12 friction. We'll see you all during our interactive sessions. Thank you.